Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to tonight's edition of Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey.
Hello, everyone.
And we're broadcasting on 101.7 FM across the Fraser Valley from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation. And if you are a regular listener to this show, you will know that it is a talk show all about metaphysics and spirituality. And if you're new to the show, well, boy, we've got a great show in store for you. Our goal is to educate and inspire you in that realm of everything about meditation, intuition, and all of those really fascinating topics. And I wanted to start today's show by reading a couple of my favorite quotes. And if you're new to the show, you probably don't know that although I teach intuition, I'm actually a scientist by background, so I love it when scientists have great things to say about intuition. So Albert Einstein said, "The rational mind is a faithful servant, and the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." And another famous scientist, Nikola Tesla, said, "My brain is only a receiver. In the universe, there is a core from which we obtain knowledge, strength, and inspiration." So how can it be, listeners, that two of the greatest scientific minds in our recent known history validated intuition, and yet the majority of thought leaders today are still very stuck within the limitations of the logical mind? Why is there such a gap between what is studied by most universities and scientists and professors and what people experience directly within themselves? Because most people have some experience of their own intuition. And this is you can probably tell this is a subject I'm really passionate about, just because of my background, which is seated in science and intuition. And so I'm really, really grateful to our next guest for helping bridge this gap, so that this taboo can finally be lifted from our society. So let me, without further ado, introduce the guest. And his name is Mark Gober. And he's the author of a new book, which is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. And it's a revelatory look at the evidence that upends the scientific and public belief that the material world is the foremost reality, and how that reversal explains our seemingly wizard-like abilities. So Mark Gober, who's the author, says his worldview was turned upside down about 2 years ago when he was exposed to world-changing science. And he researched it extensively and wrote this book as a result. And he did it because he wanted to introduce these cutting-edge ideas to the public in an effort to shift scientific and existential thinking. And what a great service that is in writing that book. And his background is that he's actually an investment banker from Silicon Valley, and was educated at Princeton, and he studied psychology. And so I'm sure he can tell us a little bit more about his background in a moment, but without further ado, I really want to welcome our guest this evening, Mark Gober. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm really, really fascinated to talk to you and find out more about you personally and about your journey from Princeton-educated professional investment banker to someone who writes a book about intuition. And I kind of want to ask two things. One is, fill us in a little bit more about your professional background if there was anything I didn't say that I should have when I read your bio. But also, I'm very curious about any personal experiences that you've had in your own life with respect to your intuition.
So in terms of my background, you summarized it very well. I am a partner at a firm called Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley, and we advise technology companies on their business strategy as it relates to their innovation. And prior to that, I was in New York on Wall Street with UBS, a large global investment bank, and I was there during the financial crisis. So it was a very interesting time to be doing that. And prior to that, I was at Princeton University where I was captain of the tennis team. So when I tell people about my background, they are typically a bit confused as to why I wrote a book on consciousness. And this leads into your question about how I became interested and whether I had personal experiences. I was very much in the materialist mainstream scientific thinking perspective about 2 years ago and prior, where I thought life had no meaning at all because consciousness comes from the brain. And once our brain dies, once our body dies, it's over. And it's hard to find meaning in that context. And that's what I thought was true. It was then around 2 years ago that I first heard podcasts, actually. The first one that I heard was of a woman who claimed she had psychic abilities and worked with energy. And these were things that were totally foreign to me. And it didn't change my life just hearing those few podcasts, but it got me interested enough to say, what's going on? Are these people lying? Are they delusional? Is there science that could back this? And as I got into the science, I realized, wow, there's a whole body of evidence here that I just never knew about. My old worldview was based on a limited set of scientific evidence. And when I expanded that set of scientific evidence, I shifted things. In parallel, I said, okay, well, if some of these psychic phenomena are real, then I should be able to talk to I should be able to speak with psychics and energy healers, and they should be able to do things that match what my research says. And sure enough, there were people that were able to know things about me that they shouldn't be able to know over the phone, and they did some amazing things, which matched my research. So I didn't have an experience like a mystical experience or a near-death experience or something on psychedelics. That didn't happen to me, but it was working with psychics plus a very large body of scientific evidence. And when I put all of that new data set in front of my worldview, I couldn't reconcile all of that with my old way of thinking. And it led to a drastic shift in worldview.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that, thank you for sharing that, and that's fantastic. And I started reading your book, and I can't wait to read the rest of it because I think it is something that we very much need in our society. I feel like having psychic gifts is almost like the last taboo or one of the last taboos in our world. And so I'm so glad that you're out there busting these misconceptions about it. Now, why do you think this is part of your life story? That you're the person that ended up writing this book out of all the many people in the world who could have had this idea? What is it about you that makes you be able to compile this information in this way?
I ask myself that all the time these days because I see how much research has been done over many years and even centuries. People have been talking about these things, and the notion of a fundamental consciousness is an age-old mystical idea. So yeah, it's a good question. Why am I the one to compile this information now? I think my background makes me well suited to do it in a way that appeals to a mainstream audience.
Yeah.
What I do professionally at Sherpa Technology Group is very much in line with what the large consulting companies do, which is we build narratives for senior management. And that means I'm working with boards of directors who have almost no attention span, and sometimes they don't understand technical concepts. They want to know the high level very quickly. So I'm used to crafting narratives that are very concise and get a message across. So in many ways, I've been trained to do this. And I'm trained to simplify complex topics and put them out there for people to understand. Also, I've had interest in existential questions for a long time. I just used to come to different conclusions. So I think it's a combination of having a very strong personal interest in reality, plus my professional background and also academically at Princeton, it's a place where you have to write a thesis in most majors to graduate. So I'm used to doing a research type project. I had to do a big one there. So when you put all that together, for whatever reason, it happened for me. And what I didn't mention is how quickly it happened. I researched for a year straight after I became exposed to these ideas. And as I was doing that, I told friends about some of the research, and they told me it shifted their perspective on life, many of them, in a positive way. And after hearing enough of those reports, I decided to put my thoughts on paper. I took the 4th of July weekend off, which was a 4-day weekend in 2017, and I wrote for 4 days straight. And over that weekend, I finished more than half of the book, and then completed it over the next few weekends. So I did it very quickly.
Yeah, which is amazing and divinely inspired, because I think it is very difficult to write from a logical perspective that quickly without analyzing what you're writing. So that's phenomenally fast. So in the speaking to your circle of friends and associates, who I imagine many of them are in the business world, did anybody surprise you by coming forward and saying, hey, well, actually, I've been hiding in the closet and I've got these secret, psychic abilities that I know I have, or these experiences of strange phenomena that I've never really shared, but now you're coming out and talking about this, I feel a bit more comfortable. Did you encounter anything like that?
It's interesting that you asked that, because it is something that I found, is that people now open up to me and say, well, I've never told anyone this before, but I had this one experience where X, Y, and Z happened and I couldn't explain it. Or my relative had a near-death experience and I've never understood how to explain what happened to him or her. Yeah. So that is happening very often. And it has surprised me, because sometimes it's a person that I wouldn't expect to have had an experience like this. And sometimes the people that say these things to me are not necessarily bought into this alternative view of reality, but they have had an experience and don't know how to explain it.
Right, exactly. Which is, I think that very much having personal experience opens the door for people. Because if it happens to you, then it's not being made up and you're not being bamboozled. So, but I believe that we'd be hard pressed to find a single person on the planet that hasn't had some experience. I've read statistics, and this might be in your book, and I might not have got to that part yet, where something like up to 98% of people have had a deja vu experience. Up to 80% of people have had some form of precognitive dream at one point or other in their lives. And so it's happening to all of us. Mm-hmm. So time to stop ignoring it, I think.
I agree with you. And if this is the reality that we're in, then both from a scientific, a medical, and also just an existential lens, we as a society need to appreciate what reality is and how to interact in that world. And I think right now as a society, we're very much off.
I agree with you. And what's also very interesting, and again, it might be in your book, the military have researched these they've been researching intuitive decision making. So has the medical profession. People who have to make split second decisions where there's not time to calculate it in your logical mind. And so there are some organizations within our society that have been researching it for some time. It's
absolutely yes,
just not generally known about.
It's not talked about. I was shocked to find out that the U.S. military had a program using psychic spies, a phenomenon known as remote viewing, which is chapter 4 of An End to Upside Down Thinking. Yeah. What I found is that the CIA recently declassified documents that were previously private, and those documents are in my book. They say remote viewing, which is the ability to perceive with the mind alone, clairvoyance, perceiving at a distance. They say, this is a direct quote, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. Evidence too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence. That is, just as a business person, I have to look at evidence to make business decisions. When I see something like that, how do I deny what's going on? There's an incentive for the U.S. military to want this to explore it. And why should a document like that be fabricated? I think it's very compelling.
Right. And I'm certainly not someone to convince, because this is my life. I spend my life doing this stuff and teaching people how to do it. But I am so very grateful that you've come out with, in this position of talking to those who approach life from their intellect, to say, hey, it's not just these wacky people who are making it up, it's real. And that brings me to another question, because, I used to be a scientist. I used to be a business development director in biotech companies. And I never, ever, ever used to speak to my colleagues about my private life and my psychic abilities, because I was afraid that I would be ridiculed. And so I wonder, I mean, not anymore, I'm completely out of the psychic closet, but back in those days. So I wonder, were you afraid of how this might be received by some of the more intellectual, logical people around you? And if so, how did you overcome it?
Absolutely. In the beginning, I was afraid to tell anyone about it. I didn't tell friends and family about it in the beginning because I didn't have a clear way of articulating the information. Now I feel completely comfortable because the book and the way I think about it is evidence-based. There's over 700 citations. The counter arguments will be to say that a certain study was done improperly. Right. And that's a debate that's fine to have. But to dismiss offhand, I don't think one can do that with this full body of evidence. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is there is a major question about consciousness. Science Magazine has called this the number 2 question in all of science, which is, how does a brain produce consciousness? The open secret is we have no idea how it happens. So if we start with that as our basis of, wait, we have no idea where our own mind comes from, it's at least conceivable that maybe it doesn't come from the brain at all, and that's why we haven't figured it out. So I like to start with the mainstream holes in science, and then work from there.
Right. Fabulous.
And we'll see how it goes. The book is newly out, and I think people will have many different opinions on it. I am hoping that it will stimulate a lot of conversation on both sides, because the more we're talking about this, the better. Even if it's from scientists who say this is all rubbish, I'm going to run studies to prove that it's not right. Great. We need more people running studies.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's absolutely fantastic. So the title of the book is An End to Upside Down Thinking, which is why I quoted that Albert Einstein quote, because it's kind of saying the same thing. So what do you mean by, is that what you mean by upside down thinking?
Upside down thinking is the notion that consciousness comes from physical material. So this is known as materialism, which is the mainstream scientific view, which, as I mentioned, leads to a very bleak outlook on life, because it says that there was a universe 13.8 billion years ago that began with a big bang, filled the universe with physical matter, and through a bunch of random chemical reactions, we ended up with DNA. DNA led to the evolution of a human being that developed a brain, and consciousness comes out of the brain. Matter creates consciousness. What I'm arguing is that perspective is upside down, that consciousness, instead of being at the very end, is actually at the beginning, existing beyond space and time.
100% agree. You are not your physical body, you are not your brain, you are pure consciousness. And in my classes, we practice experiencing ourselves as pure consciousness outside of the body.
Very important.
And that's proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. If you can experience yourself, how can I be outside of my body still having an experience? If it's my brain, that couldn't happen. So
yes, and so you bring me to one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that I've seen so far, which is the out-of-body experience that happens in a near-death experience. So this is when a person is in cardiac arrest, for example, and I have a whole chapter on this topic.
Right.
And sometimes they describe themselves hovering over their bodies and seeing things in the room that are verified as being true when their brain and their body are physically off. So it's exactly what you say. How can there be a consciousness and memories that's occurring when the body's not functional, unless the consciousness is not dependent on the body?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And most of us have got a personal experience or somebody that we know who's had one of those near-death experiences. It happened to my father when he was in an operation. He watched it from the ceiling, listened to everything the doctors said, and then, they couldn't understand how he knew some of the things he knew about what they'd been talking about. So wonderful. We're going to take a break right now. So listeners, we're going to go to some advertisements, but you're listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, who, although he's been quite quiet so far, which is unusual. And we're talking to our guest today.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. It's wonderful. You two are doing such a great job.
Yes, and so we're joined by Mark Gober, who has written an amazing book called An End to Upside Down Thinking, which I'm very enthusiastic about and very supportive of, actually. And so when we come back after the break, we've been talking about the background to the book, but I think we should delve into some of the evidence that Mark has uncovered. So welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and today's guest, Mark Gober. Now, Mark is an investment banker who studied psychology and has recently written a book about the nature of consciousness called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And he has done an amazing job compiling over 700 different studies into the nature of consciousness and investigating different paranormal or psychic or unexplained phenomena, and showing that there is real scientific evidence for some of this stuff. And I think that's what we should talk about now, is what some of the scientific evidence that Mark has come across when he was researching and writing this book. And so let's put you on the spot and ask you about some different types of psychic experiences and psychic abilities. So one of the ones that really fascinates people is telepathy. And I know that, some people have the experiences that they feel that they can communicate telepathically with their animals. Some people even, I know there's studies about telepathy between plants and, and human to human nonverbal communication in that way. What can you tell us about that? What's the evidence from a logical scientific standpoint?
Well, there are many anecdotal cases, particularly with people that have emotional closeness. For example, they have a tendency to know when the other person's in danger. Identical twins, for example, have many examples of this. But there's a study that's been done over many decades that relates to an everyday person who hasn't been trained in psychic abilities, and still there is an effect that's shown. And Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, who I think is one of the leading scientists in the world in this area, in his recent book called Real Magic, he talks about several areas of psychic phenomena that have 6 sigma statistical results. What that means is that the odds that the effect is just happening by chance is more than 1 billion to 1. So in normal areas of science, when we get 6 sigma, it's accepted. Telepathy is an area where we have 6 sigma. The study that I'll describe has been repeated by scientists over many decades. And when you put all the trials together, you end up with a strong statistical effect. So the study is called the Gansfeld experiment. And one person is put into a room, we'll call that person Bob, into a relaxed state, listening to relaxing music, almost a meditative state. There's another person, Jane, who's in another room. Jane is shown a picture by the experimenters, and the experimenters say, Jane, I want you to mentally send an image of this to Bob. I know it sounds crazy, but just act like you're telepathically sending him an image. Bob, after a while of being in this relaxed state, is taken out of the state, and he's shown 4 pictures, one of which is the one that Jane was looking at. The experimenters say, Bob, which of the 4 was Jane sending you mentally? And remember, Bob has not seen the picture that Jane was sending mentally. Bob hasn't talked to Jane. We would predict, if there were no effect, that Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, 25%.
Right.
But what do we find? the experimenters find, again, over many trials when you combine the data, is that it's closer to 32%. From a statistical standpoint, this is massive. And it suggests that there is a subtle telepathic ability that we all have, because the people in these studies are everyday people who haven't necessarily trained themselves. So when we think about this from a day-to-day standpoint, it actually makes a lot of sense, because we're not 100% telepathic all the time. And sometimes we'll think of somebody and we'll get a phone call from them a few seconds later. And it's like, it happens every now and then. And that might explain this 7% differential of 32 versus 25%.
Yeah. And as a professional psychic who teaches people this stuff, what I would say is that the reason that people are experiencing it at such a low percentage, even though it's statistically significant, is because we are all so trained to operate almost exclusively from our logical minds, and because there is so much going on in people's material, physical reality, and all of their senses are generally attuned to that. But if you take anyone and teach them to meditate using the appropriate meditation techniques, which are ancient techniques that assist you in opening these gifts, you could get that percentage in the general population to increase significantly. Mm-hmm. Once people know how to do it.
Absolutely. And it's not something that we're taught in today's day and age. And it's not being fostered. I completely agree with you. But it's still amazing to me that there is this effect for people who have never been trained.
Yeah.
It's really, really compelling. And some scientists will say, well, it's just a small effect. Why should we care about it? I don't buy that line of reasoning. There should be no effect at all if there were no impact of mental influence. And there are many things in the world that are small but significant, like bacteria. I mean, the Ebola virus, for example, that is microscopic. It is very small, but very significant. So here we have relatively small effects that we should not just ignore.
I completely agree with you. And especially because if you're just testing the general population, they have been biased since birth by the culture that they're in and the way that their brains have been trained.
Absolutely. So, myself included.
And you know, just an anecdote, you know, I went to university for 8 years and studied a PhD. And so I had to do 8 years worth of training to get my psychic abilities and to deprogram myself from that training, actually. Well, it didn't take me that long, but I did do 8 years of training. So, I mean, I feel like I'm walking, talking evidence that this is an innate ability within all humans, if we put our focus and our attention there. So, anyway, I want to ask you about some other types of psychic abilities. And what about precognition? Knowing that something is about to happen before it happens. And there's been a great example in your field when the Twin Towers went down. There were so many people who didn't turn up for work that day. That was beyond statistical significance. So what other evidence can you give us of precognition being a real thing?
Yep, absolutely. And before I dive into the evidence, I just want to provide context for your listeners again. The reason that I go through each of these phenomena in the book, and in terms of psychic phenomena, there's a chapter on telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, animals, and psychokinesis, which is mind affecting matter. The reason that I do that is to say that if any of these phenomena are real, then we can't explain them using this conventional perspective that consciousness comes from and is limited to the brain. However, if any of them are real, then we can explain them very well if consciousness is primary to matter and exists beyond space and time. So telepathy, that's an example of some kind of a non-local influence. Makes sense under this alternative framework. Yeah. Precognition, which we'll discuss, if consciousness is beyond space and time, it's at least conceivable that consciousness could almost reach forward and know something before it happens.
Absolutely.
Okay. So precognition, this is knowing the future before it happens. And as you mentioned, there are some cases where on 9/11, for example, the flight occupancy rates were much lower than normal that day. So is that some kind of a precognitive effect? Maybe. There is an effect in, actually this is crossing over to psychokinesis, but There were studies using random number generator machines. So these are machines that behave randomly on a typical basis. They spit out zeros and ones, 50% zeros, 50% ones. But when there is a global event in which people have their emotions focused on something, the machines behave non-randomly. And they're just set up all over the world. On 9/11, not only did they behave non-randomly, but they behaved non-randomly slightly before the planes hit the towers, which is almost to suggest that there was a global precognition that this was going to happen, which is totally mind-blowing. But that's one case. The studies to me that are really, really compelling are known as pre-sentiment studies, where it's a sensing of the future. It's a subset of precognition. Mm-hmm. And these are studies where people's bodily functions are measured before something is shown. And what's done in the studies is the typical psychological experiment is reversed in time. The typical experiment would show someone an arousing image, for example. So it might be a violent picture or an erotic picture, and we know that the body unconsciously responds to it. So the skin, known as a galvanic skin response, that lights up. The pupils dilate, the brain responds in a certain way, the heart responds in a certain way. So we know that if we show the picture, then we measure the body, there's a response afterwards. What experimenters have done is to look at what happens before the image is shown. And the person who's looking at a screen that is going to show a picture doesn't know what will come up. They don't know if it will be a peaceful picture, like a picture of a mountain, or something that's very arousing. What's found is that the body responds in a direction that's related to the picture eventually shown, but it happens a few seconds before the picture is shown.
Right, because they're tapping into the quantum field, which has reached close to 100% probability that is going to be the picture by that point in our linear time frame. It would be my attempt at explaining it.
I think you're probably right. Yes, and it's a very subtle effect. So the person doesn't necessarily know it's happening. You know, their skin is reacting, and you need a measuring device to even tell that it's happening, and you require statistics for it. But maybe you're right that the future at that point is so highly probable to happen that the body knows it unconsciously.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's wonderful. So now another one we touched upon, you called it psychokinesis. I usually use the term telekinesis, which is how the mind or our consciousness can impact physical matter. You know, so we as pure consciousness, how we impact physical matter. And that question can relate to manifestation and the law of attraction, which is a big thing. Like how do we manifest in physical reality as consciousness? That can relate to energy healing, because energy healing is creating change in physical matter. If you're working on someone with a physical disease, it's at that level. And then also telekinesis, which is the classic spoon bending. I had a client once who every time she got on a bus, the bus would break down because she had out of control telekinesis. So what's the evidence of those things?
Well, on a subtle level, again, going back to statistics, the studies using random number generators that I mentioned earlier. Now, these were done at Princeton University, and I was at Princeton and didn't even know these were going on because they were so controversial and not talked about. But the lab, called the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, was run for 27 years at Princeton, and it was run by the former Dean of Engineering, Dr. Robert John, who is a rocket scientist. Okay, so these are very credible people looking at these studies, and the basic design is as follows. You have a machine that is randomly generating zeros and ones in a totally random fashion, so you get 50% ones, 50% zeros. Okay. What the experimenters ask is a person who's not even necessarily on site to put their mind to the machine and try to influence it mentally so that it produces more ones than zeros. Conventional perspectives would say there should be no effect at all. But when we look at the statistics, it ends up being slightly more ones than zeros, as if the person is mentally influencing the outcome. And again, this is another Six Sigma example where the odds against chance are over 1 billion to 1 over all the trials that have been run. So it shows that at the very least there's a subtle effect that can be done. I mentioned earlier the studies on 9/11. which are slightly different. It uses the same machines of random number generators, but it's called the Global Consciousness Project, where the machines are set up all over the world, and all day long, zeros and ones are being generated, and it's 50% ones, 50% zeros. What the experimenters do is look at what happens during a very big event, whether it's 9/11 or Princess Diana's death, or something where we know that the many people in the world are focused on a single event. And what is found in many of the events is that there is a non-randomness of the machines, where the machine's producing slightly more ones than zeros, and it's corresponding to an event that happened.
Right. So precognition, right, just for the viewers, listeners, is being able to have advance notice of an event that then appears in physical reality. Psychokinesis or telekinesis, at least according to my definition, is being able to influence and change physical matter in real time by focusing your intention on doing so.
Yes.
So thank you for sharing that. Now, we talked a little bit about near-death experiences already, but here's another subject that's close to my heart, because I actually do past life readings. I've done thousands and thousands of them. So it's sort of, and I've remembered hundreds of my own. So it's second nature to me. I take it as absolute, real. I don't even need to question it. However, I'm sure that there are lots of people out there in the academic community and the world at large who might and would demand to see the scientific evidence so that they can be open to considering it. So what is the evidence? What studies have been done on past lives?
Okay, so past lives, I do discuss this in chapter 11, and to me the most compelling scientific evidence, beyond many anecdotal cases of people under hypnosis or people that do more psychic readings where this is reported all the time, the studies I'm referring to were at the University of Virginia and are ongoing. More than 50 years worth of studies at their Division of Perceptual Studies. Some very credible scientists. Dr. Ian Stevenson, Dr. Jim Tucker is currently there, a number of others. And they are looking at what children, usually between the ages of 2 and 5 years old, are describing. And over 2,500 cases around the world exist in which the children describe a life that's not theirs. And it's very detailed. Sometimes the children have personal preferences that don't make any sense, like craving alcohol or tobacco when they haven't been exposed to these things. And remember, these are young children. Sometimes they're describing very detailed things, and the researchers are able to find a person that died in the exact manner that the children described. It is very difficult to explain through conventional means.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, in the years that I've been doing this, mostly what comes up is ordinary people that you can't verify. But occasionally I've had people who've been able to research and verify. So I had one lady who, there was a lifetime as a professor at a university in the United States, and she actually managed to find this person. Had another person who was Charlie Chaplin. And after I told her, she rolled her sleeve up and she said, I don't know why, but I got a tattoo of Charlie Chaplin on my shoulder. And I've never really understood why I did it. I've got loads of anecdotes like that. Or a detective in the police force who was a reincarnation of Grace Kelly, who said, I've got this saying that I always say if I put on a nice outfit that I like, I say, oh, that's so Grace Kelly. And I don't even know why I say it, because, she's just some actress from years ago. But I say this. And so I think that these little experiences, pepper our reality without people even knowing why these things are bleeding into their consciousness.
Absolutely. I think there's a tendency in modern society to think, oh, well, something in my brain or my genetics are influencing everything that's happening. But there are these influences that seemingly have nothing to do with our personal genetics, don't even have anything to do with our personal environment, and yet they are affecting the memories and preferences. But even beyond that, we sometimes see in the studies where the children have birthmarks or physical deformities that match how they describe dying. So there's a physical effect that's beyond genetics and environment.
Yeah, I've seen that too. Yeah, no, it's amazing. We're going to go to another break in just one moment. But before we do, just very quickly in 1 or 2 minutes, how has mainstream thinking got so off base? Why did they go so off on a polarized tangent in one direction and miss all of this?
I really, really wonder. I think we tend to be biased by what we can perceive. And I think we forget how little our eyes can show us, even though we know that there are many bands of electromagnetic forms of light, and our eyes can only see a very small segment. We sometimes forget that, and we assume that we know more than we do. And right now we're kind of at an extreme that I hope we will come back from.
Yeah, so do I. And that even bleeds into those people who are into developing their psychic abilities. There's so much misinformation out there about how to do it. And you have people trying to use their physical eyes to see clairvoyantly, for example, which is not how it works. Anyway, we're going to go to a break, listeners, and we'll be back to have a more conversation with our fascinating guest, Mark Gober, who's written an amazing book called An End to Upside Down Thinking. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie, Corey, and our guest, Mark Gober. And we are absolutely enthralled and fascinated to hear Mark's stories of real scientific evidence for the true nature of consciousness, in that it's not produced from our brain, in that we are multidimensional, eternal beings of pure consciousness, and we create our reality from our consciousness and not from our physical brains. So, how? Now, there are a small percentage of people like me, maybe 3% at most, probably less than that, who are really into this stuff and really, really believe it and have their own personal experiences and evidence that just their mind could never be changed, because they know deep inside themselves that this is the truth of our reality. But then there's the other 97%, or even more than that, of the population who's still caught in what you were calling materialism. So what's the potential for this? Well, you're calling it like a new line of thinking, or the realization of this information, and people waking up, more and more people waking up to this and buying into it. How is it going to change the planet? How is it going to change individuals' lives?
Well, I certainly hope that it has a global impact. I know in my personal life, it has changed everything in a very positive way. Once I understood the real nature of reality and have aligned with it, things have just started lining up in so many ways. I've seen it happen with friends. I actually have a friend who read my book and told me over 3 weeks her whole life shifted and is now continuing to shift rapidly. I would love to see this do that on a much bigger scale, especially right now where I think our world is in major disarray. And to me, it comes from, at the core, a misunderstanding of reality and a false belief in pure individuality, where we are all fundamentally separate and finite beings. I think the science challenges that assumption, and that assumption of pure individuality leads to all of the problems that we're seeing. So I'm really hoping that my book can contribute to a shift on the planet, because if not, we're not in great shape.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll share a really short anecdote. I've got a book coming out soon, which is about psychic abilities and intuition, but it's written more from it's not written from an intellectual, it's written more guiding people through the experience of it within themselves. And there's a lady I interviewed for it, and she used to work for the intelligence services, not doing remote viewing or anything, just an ordinary job, but in the intelligence services. And when she retired, she started having precognitive dreams about terrorist attacks. And she had many of them that she verified and documented, because she started telling her family members about it before it happened. And then it would appear on the news. And even to the point that she would find herself located in her dream into the body of another person who was experiencing the terrorist attack, and seeing those people then be interviewed in the aftermath of the terrorist attack. And I said to her, why is this happening to you? And she said, well, you know, it's not about being a famous, you know, psychic phenomenon that everyone can be awed at. What it's really about is to help people understand who we are, that we're not so separate after all, you know, that I am you and you are me.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, you're reminding me of a phenomenon that I think about all the time, and it's from the near-death experience. Something that is reported, and remember, this is when people have highly impaired brains, or sometimes their brain is completely off. They experience a life review where their whole life is experienced in a flash, and they're judging themselves for how they acted. But in the cases that really get me thinking are ones in which the life reviewer, let's call it Bob, is having a life review. During his life, he harmed Jane. During his life review, he might experience that through Jane's eyes. He'll experience the event as if he were Jane, and he's judging himself for how much pain he caused her. And then he comes back into his body caring much more about how he treats other people.
Right.
So,
he's had the personal experience of both sides of the polarity and embodied it and brought it back into balance within himself.
And if we are interconnected as part of the same consciousness, that phenomenon makes sense. It's almost like the lens through which we view reality flips, and it's able to flip in that state of consciousness. But it really brings to light that interconnectedness that we're not seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And while we were talking, it reminded me, I've read the first chapter of your book so far, and I'm absolutely going to read the whole thing because I think it's fantastic. But I think you were talking about blind people at one point, and it reminded me of, I kind of went to psychic school. I went to a modern day mystery school, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And one of the people that was training alongside me was blind. And she had been blind her whole life. When she learned how to activate and use her clairvoyance, she could see color, and she could see events and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do discuss this exact phenomenon with regard to near-death experiences. There are cases where people who have been blind since birth are able to see during their near-death experience, then they come back into their body and they're not able to see anymore. So it's suggesting that the awareness we have, the researchers call it, they were trying to figure out how could this be possible. They call it a transcendental awareness that we must have, where our ability to sense things is not dependent upon the organs in our body. That's what's being suggested. Yeah.
Cool. Now, I do feel like we're in the midst, spiritually speaking, of a really huge shift on our planet. So many things are changing for us. If it's what's going on in terms of our approach to money in the financial industry, or the Me Too movement, or some of the things that are going down in politics, and we're basically, the vibration on the planet's going up, and the light is being shone on stuff that and it's not able to hide anymore, and people are standing up and changing things. We're in the midst of a really, really big shift. So much is changing on our planet. And one of the things is we have these individuals showing up in our reality who really are able to think about the planet in a very different way, in a very unlimited way, and in a very altruistic way, and in a way of the evolution of humanity. And Elon Musk is a really, really good example of that. And so can you draw a parallel between those types of people and their ideas and what you've been researching in your book? And by the way, I'm just going to throw in, when I look at Elon Musk psychically, I have to say, he's not of this world. He's got no past lives. He hasn't got a past life timeline, which makes him very interesting indeed to me.
Wow. So no previous lives at all, or do you just mean no previous lives
on this planet
here? Okay.
Here, he's a very evolved being, but he's not. He's new to this world, which means he's not limited. I mean, he's not limited by the same ways that many of us who've been here thousands of times before are, right? He sort of can take a different perspective. He's not limited. He's very easy for him to create new things and manifest new things and think of things that we might say are impossible.
Yeah, he's quite the visionary. And I do mention him in my book. I look at his new startup called Neuralink, which is a brain-focused startup. He calls it a wizard hat for the brain.
Yeah.
From the bits and pieces that he's released about this product, I wonder if he's actually missing the point with regard to consciousness, where he's kind of taking the materialist perspective of looking how we can optimize the brain, thinking that the brain is the producer of consciousness. And I wonder if he could build an even better product if he viewed the brain as being like a receiving mechanism or a filtering mechanism of consciousness, and how we might be able to enhance intuitive abilities. So I actually mentioned that in the book and really hope that he reads it, because he is a visionary. And if he is not thinking about consciousness in this way, I'm not sure if he is, then who knows what he could help us do.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and that's really interesting. Yes, so rather see the brain as a piece of circuitry that consciousness is flowing through and interacting with the world through, as opposed to the producer of it. That's very interesting, and so here's another point that maybe I'll make, just because I said that thing about Elon Musk, is just because you might come here from another reality doesn't mean that once you're in a human body you're not like everybody else, right? Because once you're in a human body, you're in a human body, and that comes along with all of the challenges of being in a human body, the intellect being one of the main ones and the emotions being another. Spiritual development is about how to master that level of physical reality. So it's you, the pure spiritual consciousness, that is consciously creating your reality and being able to be in partnership with the body, but not letting the body be the one, not letting the vehicle drive the show, but letting the chauffeur, which is you, the consciousness.
It is a really hard thing to do, I think, because like I said, we're so biased by what we can perceive actively, which is our eyes, our ears, our nose, and our mouth. And that's such a limited perspective. So we get so tied into the body, it feels like the body is it. So to take on this perspective we're describing is really abstract. And if someone hasn't had direct experiences, whether it's a psychedelic or near-death experience, it's hard, I think, to come around to these ideas. And I'm hoping that science will do it, but it's still very difficult.
Well, and I would just add to that, from my perspective, the pathway for that is science can help explain it and it can help open people's minds to it. But the way to open people up to this is through meditation, and to teach them about their spiritual anatomy, to teach them about their different spiritual gifts and how to consciously operate them. And I mean, I've sat in front of a room of lawyers and taught them how to instantly tell if somebody's telling a lie using their clairvoyance. And so it can be done.
The one thing, just to interject just one thought, one thing that has to be done is people have to learn the difference between the effect that this can have on their life and entertainment. Because a lot of people are still looking at this as an entertainment, as entertainment value.
Yeah.
Completely. I agree with you. I think, and there's also great responsibility that comes with using these abilities and making sure they're being used for non-recreational purposes only. There are other ways of using this knowledge.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, you know, we talked about politicians and the military, and the Nazi Party in World War II used to use esoteric and occult practices as well. And so, like any tool, it's humanity's responsibility with each and every one of us to choose how we wield those powers and what we use them for.
Absolutely. That's a very important point.
Yeah. And on that note, unfortunately, unfortunately, it's time to end the show. And there's so much more to talk about, Mark. And I would love, yeah, I would love to have you back.
Thank you.
Yes,
I would love that.
It's really important information. And I'm so glad that you've compiled it in this way. So thank you so much. I should ask you, how can listeners get a hold of you? We will post your web link on our article when we do the podcast, but tell them verbally now.
My website is my name, Mark Gober, MarkGober.com, and that has information on my book, which is also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Also, I will be releasing a podcast in the next few months in which I interview scientists that I talk about in my book. And I think that will be another way to express the information to people who sometimes want to hear it from the people themselves.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's the end of our show. And we'll be back next week at 7 o'clock. Unlocking Your Truth is always on Tuesdays at 7 o'clock on 101.7 FM, and that's Pacific time. And in the meantime, if you want to send us questions to receive an intuitive insight, you can write to info@drlesliephillips.com.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillips.com. That's drlesliephillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.